Imagine a place where the dirt was worth more than gold. A place where a single family could wake up one morning poor and by nightfall be among the richest people on the planet. This wasn't some fairy tale. This was Oklahoma in the 1920s, and these people were the Osage Nation. They had a treasure hidden beneath their reservation, not diamonds, but oil. So much oil that every single enrolled Osage person received a headright, a legal share of the oil income. The money poured in, transforming traditional Osage life into one of chauffeured cars, silk dresses, and sprawling brick mansions. They were the talk of the world. People literally called them the wealthiest people per capita in the world. But with that much wealth, there came a darkness, a shadow that crept into their lives. A quiet, terrifying evil that earned a simple, chilling nickname, the Reign of Terror. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about greed. It's the story of a conspiracy so vast and so brutal that it forced a tiny, brand new government agency to step into the darkness and ultimately become the powerful organization we know today. This is the murder that created the FBI. Get comfortable, because this is a deep dive into the Osage murders. The year was 1921. Fairfax, Oklahoma, was buzzing. It wasn't the sound of cattle or quiet prairie wind. It was the rumble of oil derricks, the honking of imported luxury cars, and the chatter of ambitious men, white men, who'd come to orbit the Osage Nation. The Osage people, who had been pushed onto this land because it was considered worthless, had the last laugh. Beneath their reservation, now a legal trust, lay some of the largest, most valuable pools of crude oil in North America. The federal government, in its great wisdom, had divided the mineral rights among the enrolled members, the headrights. And the money was staggering. Picture this, an Osage family in a grand house, with servants, talking on a telephone that was still a novelty to most Americans, while riding in a Rolls-Royce. These were not poor people, but the wealth came with a catch. The government, under the guise of protection, had declared many Osage people incompetent to manage their own fortunes. If you were deemed incompetent, a court-appointed guardian, almost always a white man, was put in charge of your money, controlling every single expense, from a gallon of gas to a new house. For many Osage, this system of guardianship was a gilded cage, a humiliating control over their own lives. Molly Kyle, a full-blood Osage woman, was one such individual who had a substantial headright. She lived comfortably, married to a white man named Ernest Burkhart, and was one of 3 sisters who all shared in the incredible oil wealth. Molly was part of the old world and the new. She spoke the Osage language, held to her traditions, but she also drove a car and lived in a nice house. She was smart and respected, but she was also a target, though she didn't know it yet. The air around Fairfax, though rich with the smell of oil and money, began to grow heavy with fear. It started subtly, a sickness, a sudden, fast-moving illness that took a life. Then it became more overt. The first major crack in the facade of prosperity was the murder of Anna Brown. Anna, Molly's sister, was found dead in a remote ravine after a night out. She'd been shot in the head. It wasn't a robbery. Her jewelry was untouched. It was cold, brutal execution. The local law enforcement, such as it was overwhelmed, or perhaps simply uninterested in a thorough investigation. The case went cold quickly. But the murder of Anna Brown was not an isolated incident. It was the chilling opening act of a much larger, darker play. The whispers began, whispers of a curse, of bad medicine, or worse, of a systematic plot. The Osage knew deep down, this wasn't a random event. This was the dark side of their immense fortune finally showing its ugly face. The shadows were lengthening over the prairie, and the reign of terror had just begun. Anna Brown's murder should have been enough to wake everyone up, but in the Oklahoma oil boom, life and death often moved at a frightening speed. While her case stalled, the terror didn't pause. Less than 2 months later, another Osage member, Charles Whitehorn, also known as Charles Redcorn, was found murdered. Like Anna, he was shot in the head, and the circumstances were just as baffling. No witnesses, no clear motive beyond the general desire for Osage wealth. Molly Kyle, still grieving her sister, tried to hold her family together, but the anxiety was a physical weight. Her other sister, Rita Smith, and Rita's husband, Bill, began to fear for their lives. They tried to take precautions, locking their doors, But how do you lock out a killer who might already be inside your circle? The guardianship system meant that dozens of white men knew the intimate financial details of the Osage and held power over their very existence. The line between a protector and a predator was thin and easily crossed. Then came the explosion. In March 1923, Rita and Bill Smith's house was completely leveled by a massive bomb. The blast was so powerful it rattled windows miles away. When the dust settled, there was nothing left but a smoldering ruin. Both Rita and Bill were killed instantly. Their white servant, Nettie Brookshire, who had been asleep in the house, also died. The horror was now undeniable, impossible to ignore. This wasn't a random shooting. This was an organized, sophisticated act of mass murder. The cumulative effect on the Osage community was devastating. People stopped traveling alone. They started looking at their white neighbors, their business partners, even the doctors who treated them, with deep suspicion. The death count kept rising, not just murders, but also wasting illnesses and unexplained accidents that always seemed to target a relative of a headright holder. It was a pattern, a mathematical elimination of heirs. Every death moved the headrights of the deceased closer to a surviving Osage relative, and then, by marriage or will, into the hands of a white spouse or heir. Local authorities were useless. They either lacked the skill, the resources, or the will to tackle a conspiracy of this size. Sheriffs and marshals would investigate briefly, blame it on alcohol, or dismiss the victims as being involved in some local feud. But the Osage knew different. They had a phrase, "The buzzards are circling." They were being hunted, systematically, for their money. The local law was either too scared, too corrupt, or too slow. The Osage Nation realized they needed help from outside. They needed someone with real power, someone who was not already compromised by the wealth and the greed of Osage County. They needed to bypass the state and go straight to the federal government. The mounting death toll, now over 24 suspicious deaths in just a few years, was an embarrassment and a tragedy. The Osage Tribal Council, desperate and fearing total annihilation, took the only action they felt they had left. They pooled their own resources and decided to hire a private detective. But this wasn't enough. The scale of the crimes pointed toward a conspiracy that went deeper than any local investigator could unravel. The Osage finally reached out to Washington, D.C. They were seeking justice, but what they got was a brand new, untested government bureau. At this time, the agency we know as the Federal Bureau of Investigation barely existed. It was called the Bureau of Investigation, BOI, a small, underfunded group within the Department of Justice that mainly dealt with issues like bank fraud and land disputes. The Bureau was run by a young, ambitious, and intensely secretive man named J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was keen to prove the value and necessity of his nascent organization, which was often mocked as being little more than a collection of former local cops and lawyers. The Osage murders provided the perfect, high-stakes proving ground. Hoover assigned the case to a former Texas Ranger named Tom White. White was everything a good lawman should be: honest, experienced, quiet, and absolutely tenacious. He understood that this case was not just about a few murders. It was a test of justice itself. White was given a small, hand-picked team of undercover agents. This was critical. The Osage knew that the conspiracy was so deep that any outsider arriving with a badge and flashing lights would be spotted immediately, and the investigation would be over before it started. Tom White knew he couldn't trust the local law. In fact, he had to assume that some local officials were part of the problem. His plan was daring. His agents would go undercover, pretending to be insurance salesmen, cattle buyers, and oil prospectors. They would live among the people of Osage County, watch, and listen, slowly piecing together the web of fear and greed. When Tom White and his men arrived, they didn't have the modern forensic tools we imagine today. They had their wits, their notebooks, and their absolute commitment to secrecy. The key, White knew, was to find the motive, and the motive was always the headrights. They had to trace the money, follow the deaths, and link the murders back to one central figure or group. This was going to be a long, dangerous game of cat and mouse, played out on the dusty, oil-rich plains of Oklahoma. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The survival of the Osage people and the very reputation of the Bureau of Investigation hung in the balance. The hunt was on. Tom White's investigation began with a deep, silent dive into the corrupted heart of Osage County. His agents, an all-star cast of undercover operatives, had to become ghosts. One was a former detective named Frank Smith, who posed as an insurance salesman. Another, a Native American agent named John Wren, proved invaluable for his ability to move within the community with less suspicion. They learned quickly that almost everyone had a hand in the Osage's money, and everyone was watching everyone else. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia. The early work focused on Molly Kyle's family, the one hit hardest by the terror. Her sisters, Anna and Rita, were dead. Her mother was also deceased. Her remaining head rights, and the estates of her dead sisters, were tied up in a complicated web. Molly herself was an heir, and if she were to die, her significant wealth would pass to her surviving family. Her husband, Ernest Burkhart, a white man, was one of the central figures in her life. Ernest was a seemingly simple, amiable man, a former chauffeur who had married into the wealth. He worked for his uncle, a powerful, well-regarded figure in the area, William King Hale. King Hale was the true power broker of Fairfax. He wasn't some back-alley thug. He was a pillar of the community. He was a wealthy cattle rancher, a deputy sheriff, and known to lend money and provide favors to both white and Osage residents. He was charming, generous, and had a smile that could disarm anyone. But beneath the surface of respectability, Tom White and his men began to uncover something colder. Hale had cultivated his wealth by systematically taking control of Osage financial affairs. He was a guardian to multiple Osage people, a major creditor, and deeply intertwined with Molly's family. The agents discovered that Ernest Burkhart was completely subservient to his powerful uncle. The more the agents dug, the more the lines of the various murders seemed to converge on King Hale. Every single person killed, Anna Brown, Charles Whitehorn, Rita, and Bill Smith, had a financial or familial connection that, upon their death, benefited someone associated with Hale. The sheer number of victims and the common thread of their head rights were too much to be coincidence. White realized that he wasn't looking for a lone killer, but a mastermind, a man who had orchestrated a systematic, years-long plot to inherit a vast fortune through murder. The respectable cattleman, the deputy sheriff, the community pillar, he was the central villain in the Osage tragedy. But proving it was the impossible task. The case against King Hale was entirely circumstantial at first. He had motive, immense wealth, and opportunity. But White needed proof that linked Hale directly to the killings. The agents spent weeks listening in on conversations, pretending to be drunk in pool halls, and attending social functions, always with one ear open. They had to build the case from the ground up, identifying the network of associates Hale used to carry out his deadly plan. The first major break came by focusing on the bombing of Rita and Bill Smith. The use of explosives suggested a specific kind of expertise, and White's team narrowed down the suspects to a few individuals in Hale's orbit who had knowledge of nitroglycerin and demolition. Two men emerged as prime suspects for the physical acts of violence: Kelsey Morrison and Blackie Thompson, career criminals and known associates of King Hale. These were the guns for hire, the men who would do the dirty work for a cut of the future inheritance. The BOI agents knew they couldn't just arrest these men. The whole conspiracy would collapse, and King Hale would walk free, having bought off every witness and corrupted every official. They needed leverage. They needed one of the conspirators to crack under pressure and turn state's evidence against the king. Tom White decided to focus his attention on Ernest Burkhart, Molly's husband. Ernest was the closest link to Hale, the man who had physically married into the head rights. He was also the weakest link. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a lackey, torn between his greed, his fear of his uncle, and whatever residual feelings he had for his wife. The situation was growing more desperate for the BOI. Edgar Hoover was growing impatient for results, and the agents were living under constant threat of exposure. Local law enforcement, many of whom were friends or business partners of Hale, were actively trying to get the BOI agents thrown out of the county. Every day, the Osage people continued to suffer, and Molly Kyle's health was mysteriously deteriorating, suggesting she might be the next target. Tom White had to act fast. He knew the key to the entire case was forcing a wedge between Ernest Burkhart and King Hale. Tom White realized that the only way to get the proof he needed was to isolate the weakest link and use the threat of the death penalty to force a confession. That man was Ernest Burkhart. The BOI agents gathered their evidence, enough to implicate Ernest in the conspiracy, specifically his involvement in the bombing of his own home to kill his wife's sister, Rita. White's team meticulously planned the arrest. It had to be done with absolute secrecy to prevent Hale from interfering. Once Ernest was in custody, Tom White decided to use a psychological pressure cooker. He brought Ernest in for questioning, not in the local jail, which was full of Hale's cronies, but in a distant, secure federal facility. The interrogation was a masterclass in law enforcement strategy. White, calm and direct, laid out all the evidence. He described in detail how Ernest's uncle, King Hale, had used him as a pawn, promising a future of vast wealth, but always keeping Ernest in the line of fire. Crucially, White focused on the murders of Molly's family and, most importantly, on Molly herself. At the time of the arrest, Molly was gravely ill. Doctors couldn't diagnose her ailment, but the BOI suspected she was being slowly poisoned, a classic ploy in a conspiracy to inherit. White made it clear to Ernest that by remaining silent, he was condemning his own wife to death. He also presented Ernest with a terrible choice: cooperate and save his life, or stay loyal to his uncle and face the electric chair. The pressure worked. Ernest Burkhart, seeing the full scope of his betrayal laid out before him, and perhaps realizing that his uncle would eventually cut him loose, finally broke. He confessed his part in the conspiracy, particularly in setting up the bombing of the Smith home, and, most crucially, he implicated King Hale as the mastermind. Ernest's confession was the golden ticket. It wasn't just a confession to a single crime. It was the key that unlocked the entire, vast conspiracy. The Bureau of Investigation now had the hard evidence it needed to take down the most powerful man in Osage County. Tom White immediately organized a massive, coordinated sweep to arrest King Hale and his various hired hands before they could flee or silence Ernest forever. The small, untested BOI had just pulled off its first major victory. The moment Ernest Burkhart's confession was secured, Tom White knew he had mere hours before word leaked out and King Hale made his move. White organized a coordinated effort involving federal marshals and the few local lawmen he actually trusted. The arrests were swift and silent. King Hale was apprehended at his sprawling ranch. When the agents showed him the federal warrant, the famous charm vanished, replaced by cold fury. Hale, always used to being in control, was genuinely stunned that a small, federal agency had managed to circumvent his local power structure. Along with Hale, agents also brought in some of the physical killers Ernest had implicated, including Kelsey Morrison. The BOI agents moved them immediately out of Osage County. They didn't use the local jail. They transported the prisoners to Guthrie, far away from the potential influence of Hale's money and threats. This was a tactical masterstroke by Tom White. He knew that if the conspirators stayed local, witnesses would disappear, evidence would vanish, and the local courts, where Hale held immense sway, would never convict him. The arrest sent a shockwave through Fairfax and the entire Osage Nation. For years, the community had suspected Hale, but he was untouchable. Now, the respectable cattleman was in federal custody, charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The Osage people felt a tentative, long-awaited sense of relief, but also deep anxiety. They knew King Hale was resourceful and that his reach extended further than anyone realized. The trial was going to be the fight of his life, and the conspirators would spare no expense, use every dirty trick, and threaten every person required to ensure their freedom. Meanwhile, Molly Kyle, who was still desperately ill, was rushed away by her family for treatment outside of Osage County. Ernest's confession had saved her life. It turned out she was indeed being poisoned, slowly and deliberately. The realization that her own husband had been part of the plot to eliminate her entire family, culminating in her own slow death, was a betrayal almost worse than the poison itself. But she lived, and her survival became a critical turning point, a small but important victory for the forces of justice. The stage was now set for the trial of the century, a courtroom battle that would expose the naked greed at the heart of the American oil boom. The federal trial against King Hale, Ernest Burkhart, and their accomplices was a spectacle. It was held in the federal courthouse in Guthrie, far from Hale's local control, but the drama and the pressure followed the case like a black cloud. This was more than just a murder trial. It was a showdown between the new, determined power of the federal government and the old, entrenched corruption of local oil wealth. The prosecution, guided by the meticulous evidence gathered by Tom White's undercover team, presented a devastating narrative. They detailed how Hale had masterminded the systematic elimination of Molly Kyle's family members, Anna Brown, Rita Smith, and Bill Smith, all to consolidate the valuable Osage headrights. Ernest Burkhart's confession, though shaky and motivated by self-preservation, was the anchor of the case, directly tying Hale to the bombings and the shootings. But Hale was rich, and he was ruthless. He mounted an aggressive defense, employing the best lawyers money could buy. More dangerously, he began tampering with the witnesses. Key individuals who had initially given statements suddenly developed convenient memory loss. Jurors were threatened. There were even rumors that Hale was trying to arrange for Ernest Burkhart to be killed in prison before he could testify. The corruption that had defined the murders now spilled over into the judicial process. Tom White and the BOI agents had to work throughout the trial to protect their witnesses, often moving them from safe house to safe house, always wary of Hale's long arm. In one dramatic turn, a crucial witness, a man who had helped dispose of Anna Brown's body, recanted his testimony on the stand, clearly terrified. The prosecution scrambled to maintain credibility, fighting the tide of fear that Hale commanded. The first trial against Hale ended in a hung jury, a devastating blow to the BOI. The defense celebrated, claiming the federal government had failed. But Tom White wasn't done. He knew that the only way to beat King Hale was to keep applying pressure. He immediately prepared for a second trial, knowing this was their last chance to get justice for the Osage. The failure of the first jury only hardened Tom White's resolve. He recognized that the jury couldn't resist the pervasive fear and influence of King Hale. For the second trial, the prosecution focused on the murder of Anna Brown, the very first casualty in the Reign of Terror. This time, they leaned heavily on the testimony of Ernest Burkhart, who, facing the electric chair, had little choice but to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences for his uncle. Ernest's testimony was critical. He detailed how King Hale had ordered Anna's death, arranging for his cousin and another hitman, Kelsey Morrison, to kill her after a night of heavy drinking. This direct testimony, supported by the circumstantial evidence of the financial motive and the pattern of the subsequent deaths, was too much for the defense to overcome. The jury, perhaps realizing the weight of the conspiracy, returned a verdict of guilty. King Hale, the powerful cattleman and seemingly respectable citizen, was convicted of murder. This conviction, however, was just the start. The co-conspirators were tried separately. Ernest Burkhart, in exchange for his testimony, received a reduced sentence of life imprisonment, narrowly avoiding the gallows. Kelsey Morrison was also found guilty. The verdict sent a clear message. The federal government could and would intervene to prosecute those who used murder and corruption to steal Native American wealth. For the Osage, the verdicts provided a measure of justice, but the closure was incomplete. The investigation had focused primarily on the murders of Molly's immediate family. Many other suspicious deaths during the Reign of Terror, estimates range from 24 to over 60, were never fully solved or prosecuted. The systematic nature of the plot meant that many killers and conspirators likely walked free, having benefited from the chaos and corruption. Nonetheless, the core of the conspiracy was broken. The man who had orchestrated the terror was locked away, and the fledgling Bureau of Investigation had earned its stripes, demonstrating that federal power could, at last, stand against the tyranny of local corruption. While the conviction of King Hale and his associates was a huge victory for the Bureau of Investigation and a moment of powerful, if painful, closure for the Osage, the shadow of the Reign of Terror did not simply lift. The trials focused narrowly on the deaths of Molly Kyle's family, particularly Anna Brown and the Smiths. But the terror had claimed many more victims. For years, the Osage people had watched their friends and relatives die under suspicious circumstances, sudden illnesses, unexplained fires, and convenient suicides. Tom White and his agents knew that the number of suspicious deaths far exceeded the 4 central murders they had prosecuted. The actual death toll during the terror is still debated today, with estimates ranging from 24 to over 60 Osage individuals who held valuable headrights. Many of these cases were simply too cold, too complex, or too poorly documented by local authorities to ever be solved, even with the BOI's renewed attention. The web of corruption was so vast that it included not just hitmen and masterminds, but also corrupt doctors who signed false death certificates and complicit lawyers who helped transfer the ill-gotten wealth. The Osage community was left with a deep, permanent wound. They had seen the worst of humanity, greed turned into systematic murder, and they had seen the systemic failure of the justice system to protect them. The sense of suspicion lingered. Who else was involved? Who had gotten away with murder? The oil money continued to flow, but it was forever tainted by blood. The wealth that was meant to be a blessing had become a curse, highlighting the brutal truth that in America, even unimaginable riches couldn't buy protection or true autonomy for Native people. The BOI had done its job, bringing down the kingpin, but the lingering presence of unsolved cases served as a stark reminder of the limitations of justice in a deeply corrupted environment. The Osage Nation had to rebuild its trust, its community, and its sense of safety, all while knowing that the buzzards of greed might only be temporarily grounded. The sentences handed down to the conspirators were severe, reflecting the heinous nature of their crimes. King Hale and his nephew, Ernest Burkhart, along with Kelsey Morrison, were all sentenced to life imprisonment in federal penitentiaries. Life meant life in the 1920s, and the government believed they had effectively neutralized the threat. For King Hale, prison was a brutal adjustment. The powerful cattleman who had once commanded respect and fear was now reduced to a number. Yet, even behind bars, he continued his manipulation, hiring lawyers and pulling strings in a relentless effort to win parole. Ernest Burkhart's fate was particularly complex. He was the man who betrayed his wife and murdered her family, but his confession was the hinge upon which the entire federal case turned. His life was spared because he implicated his uncle. However, the emotional toll was immense. Molly eventually divorced him, severing the last direct link between him and the Osage millions. Ernest served many years before eventually receiving parole, a decision that caused outrage among the Osage people. He later moved back to Osage County, living out his remaining days with the stigma of being the man who betrayed the people who had given him everything. As for Molly Kyle, she was a survivor. She recovered from the slow poisoning, divorced Ernest, and later remarried. She lived a long life, but one forever marked by the loss of her mother and sisters at the hands of those closest to her. Her survival was a testament to her strength, but the murders forever changed her understanding of trust and love. The whole ordeal proved that justice is not always clean or fast, but it can eventually find its target. The legacy of these men was sealed. Hale, the mastermind who died a prisoner, and Ernest, the weak accomplice who lived a disgraced free man. The successful prosecution of the Osage murders marked a pivotal moment not just for the Osage Nation, but for the entire federal government. Tom White emerged as a national hero within law enforcement circles. His meticulous planning, his insistence on using undercover agents, and his sheer persistence in the face of widespread corruption showcased a new, effective way of federal crime fighting. He proved that a small, centralized bureau could tackle interstate crime and local corruption where state authorities had failed. The case was a massive public relations win for the young director of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover seized on the success, using the Osage murders as irrefutable evidence that his bureau needed more power, more funding, and a broader mandate. He could point to King Hale, a respected, wealthy white man brought down by his agents, and say, "This is what federal law enforcement can achieve." This case helped Hoover solidify his control and expand the BOI's capabilities. The Bureau of Investigation, largely mocked as an inconsequential agency before the Osage case, transformed. It gained public confidence, political support, and the crucial experience needed to evolve into the formidable Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. It became later in the 1930s. The lessons learned in Osage County, the importance of forensic evidence, undercover work, witness protection, and bypassing local corruption, became the foundational principles of modern federal law enforcement. Tom White was rewarded for his success, but his story took a tragic turn. Later in his career, he was ambushed and severely wounded during an escaped prisoner transport, effectively ending his active service. His quiet tenacity and unwavering moral compass stood in sharp contrast to the men he hunted, and his work on the Osage case remains one of the most important and often overlooked moments in American law enforcement history. The blood spilled on the Osage Prairie ultimately forged the agency tasked with upholding justice across the nation. The Osage murders forced a national spotlight not just on the killers, but on the deeply corrupted legal structures that enabled the entire tragedy, the guardianship system. This was the legal mechanism that allowed white men like King Hale to gain control over the vast wealth of Osage individuals deemed incompetent by the government. The system was a license for theft, exploitation, and, ultimately, murder. The very idea that a group of people, simply because of their race or cultural difference, were incapable of managing their own money while simultaneously owning the most oil-rich land in the country was a profound injustice. Before the Reign of Terror, numerous complaints and even official reports had been filed detailing how guardians were swindling their Osage wards, charging outrageous fees, and systematically draining their accounts. But these reports were consistently ignored by Washington. It took the horrific violence of the murders and the high-profile federal intervention to finally bring about change. Following the convictions, federal legislation was eventually enacted to reform the guardianship system, stripping away the absolute power held by many of the exploitative guardians. While it didn't eliminate all corruption overnight, it was a crucial step toward restoring legal and financial autonomy to the Osage Nation. The Osage people, who had fought for decades for control over their own lives and resources, had seen their demands finally validated by the blood spilled on their land. The murders became a painful, brutal catalyst that forced the government to acknowledge and partially dismantle the structural racism and economic control that had defined Native relations for generations. The battle for true sovereignty, however, continued. Decades after the conviction, the specter of the killers returned to haunt the Osage. Ernest Burkhart was granted parole in 1959, having served around 35 years for his part in the conspiracy. The decision was immediately met with resistance and shock in Osage County. To the Osage, Ernest was a symbol of the ultimate betrayal, the outsider who married into the family and then helped plan their elimination. His eventual return to Oklahoma was deeply unsettling. He was not a free man in the true sense. He was a pariah, forever marked by his crimes. For many years, he lived quietly, trying to disappear into the landscape that was once defined by his uncle's power and his own weakness. His presence served as a constant, tangible reminder of the reign of terror and the slow, painful nature of justice. In the 1960s, a movement began to grant him a full pardon. This push came primarily from his family and certain political allies, arguing that he had served his time and cooperated with the federal government. For the Osage, the thought of the last surviving conspirator receiving a full pardon was an insult to the memory of the victims. The pain was still fresh, the scars deep. Molly Kyle had long since passed away, but her relatives and the wider Osage Nation fought against the pardon vehemently. Despite the strong opposition, Oklahoma Governor David Hall granted Ernest Burkhart a full pardon in 1965. The controversy over the pardon highlighted the stark difference between legal resolution and moral justice. Though legally forgiven, Ernest remained morally condemned by the Osage community. His final years were spent in relative obscurity, a living, breathing footnote to one of the darkest chapters in American history. Today, the story of the Osage murders stands as a powerful testament to survival and resilience. Despite the horrors of the Reign of Terror, the Osage Nation endured. They maintained their cultural identity, their language, and, crucially, their ownership of the mineral rights beneath their land. The vast oil wealth continues to sustain the nation and its members, proving that the brutal plot to steal their fortune ultimately failed. The nation has taken proactive steps to protect its sovereignty and resources. They meticulously safeguard the records of the headrights, ensuring that the legacy of the oil money benefits the Osage people for generations to come. The tragic period of the 1920s is not forgotten. It is taught, remembered, and honored. It is a part of their history that serves as a constant caution against external greed and the importance of self-determination. The case also holds an undeniable significance for American history as a whole. It serves as a stark origin story for the FBI, an agency that was born out of the necessity to combat complex, large-scale corruption and violence. The Osage murders provided the proving ground that elevated the Bureau of Investigation from a small, ineffective agency to the powerful national force it became. The story of the Osage is one of ultimate triumph over evil. It is the story of a community that refused to be extinguished by greed and whose cry for justice, finally heard by men like Tom White, resulted in a reckoning that changed the landscape of American law enforcement forever. It reminds us that justice, even if slow and painful, can eventually emerge from the shadows of history. The story of the Osage murders is more than just a true crime narrative. It's a foundational story of American justice. We started in a time of unbelievable wealth, where the promise of a better life was poisoned by the darkest human failing, greed. The Reign of Terror was a calculated, cold-blooded effort to steal a nation's future, and it was only the quiet, tenacious dedication of men like Tom White and his undercover agents that finally broke the conspiracy. Think about the sheer courage it took for Molly Kyle to survive that level of betrayal, and for the Osage community to demand justice when the entire local system was rigged against them. The blood spilled on the Osage Prairie didn't just expose a murder plot. It forced the birth of the modern FBI, proving that even in the face of absolute local corruption, federal justice could prevail. It's a chilling reminder that the deadliest crimes are often committed not by strangers, but by those closest to us, wearing a mask of respectability. It makes you wonder, if the Osage hadn't been so wealthy, would the federal government have intervened at all? Let me know what you think about this incredible piece of forgotten history in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's most compelling mysteries.